The skies aren't always friendly, but in Columbia, South Carolina, Saturday, July 2nd, 1994 appeared to be a lovely summer's day. The clouds are puffy, temperature warm and pleasant. It's the 4th of July weekend and the local airport is packed with travelers bustling about to meet family and friends. At around 5:30 in the afternoon, a USAir McDonnell Douglas DC-9 makes its arrival from Charlotte, North Carolina. Pulling up to the gate, it's a very quick turnaround. The crew of this plane have to be ready to shuttle back to Charlotte in about 40 minutes. However, during the short stay in Columbia, they still have to perform pre-flight checks, review their flight plan and receive weather information, among other things too. The weather today, thus far, has been very pleasant. Some clouds, light winds, good visibility, no rain. Lovely conditions for flying. That said, USAir Dispatch has provided the crew with a weather report for their return journey, and upon reviewing this weather, conditions mostly appeared to be similar to as they were on their journey over here. There was, however, one noticeable addition. Scattered thunderstorms are appearing in the Charlotte area. Certainly not unusual for this time of year, storms are a normal part of life in the American South, and for pilots of these skies, navigating such weather is routine. It doesn't bother the pilots all that much, and they request their clearance for departure. At 6:10 in the evening, returning as USAir Flight 1016, the DC-9 leaves the gate in Columbia on time, getting airborne at 6:23. On board are 57 passengers and crew. It's a very short flight of only 35 minutes on a good day. The flight is under the command of Captain Michael Greenlee. At 38 years of age, he's already had an extensive piloting career. Serving in the Air Force from 1982, USAir employed him in 1985, where he first flew the Boeing 737, being promoted to captain on the DC-9 in 1990. He has 8,065 flight hours under his belt, with 1,970 of those hours logged in the DC-9. In the past few days, he took some time off work. He flew with his National Guard Squadron on June 28th. He also played golf, went jogging, and did martial arts. 41-year-old James Hayes is our first officer on this flight. He was folded into USAir when the airline acquired Piedmont Airlines in 1989. With nearly 13,000 flight hours to his name, he's actually been flying the DC-9 longer than his captain, with 3,180 hours logged in the type. The two pilots both commuted to Pittsburgh earlier this morning. You see, today is the first day of a 3-day work trip for the crew, and it's the first time Captain Greenlee and First Officer Hayes have worked together. The two of them get along great, like a house on fire. So, they began the day in Pittsburgh, where they left the gate there at 9:45 in the morning, heading to New York. They then flew down to Charlotte, then there was the outbound flight to Columbia, and now they are flying back. This makes Flight 1016 their fourth flight of the day, but even after arriving in Charlotte, they were then expected to continue onward to Memphis, Tennessee, where they will finally clock out for the evening, ready to do it all again tomorrow. This was a standard day in the life of a commuter airline pilot in 1990s America. Pilots often swap around their duties. First Officer Hayes is pilot flying for this leg. Captain Greenlee is handling radio communications, and only minutes into the flight, he establishes contact with Charlotte Approach, where he reports their altitude of 12,000 feet. So far, the flight is proceeding as normal, with nothing untoward. Meanwhile, in the cabin, the flight is only half full this afternoon. 52 passengers are scattered about the plane and are being looked after by 3 flight attendants. In the front is 28-year-old Richard DeMary and Shelley Marquith, also age 28, whilst 27-year-old Karen Forch is serving in the back. Today's aircraft, a 1973 manufactured Douglas DC-931, has been in operation with USAir for 20 years, first spreading her wings in 1974. November 954 Victor Juliet has accumulated nearly 54,000 flight hours in her time across 63,000 individual flights, and a recent visit to the doctor's office, or a maintenance hangar on June 28th, has given her a clean bill of health. Although weather conditions have been mostly fine all day, that has started to change. The case of USAir Flight 1016, in a way, revolves around this changing weather situation at Charlotte. We are going to take a look at that more closely as we proceed, from the point of views of air traffic controllers and pilots on the ground, in addition to USAir 1016 en route. Right now, thunderstorms have been brewing around Charlotte throughout the afternoon. They are constantly changing, and as the afternoon progresses, these storms even approach the airport in Charlotte itself. On board Flight 1016, our pilots are not all that clued into this changing weather just yet. They are aware of some stormy activity as per the weather briefing in Colombia, but this is normal for them. So long as they stay away from the worst of it, this shouldn't threaten the completion of the flight. They had tuned into and received the then current information transmitting on the Charlotte ATIS frequency. That's the Automated Terminal Information Service. Most airports have one. It's a continuous transmission of the airport terminal area information, detailing what runways are in use, any important messages pilots need to hear, and a large portion of it is reserved for current weather information. Airports want to make this accessible for pilots, so the ATIS information broadcasts on a separate radio station that a pilot can easily tune into. You can do this yourself, and you don't even need a radio. You can use the internet, or you can even call ATIS on your phone. Here's me dialing the ATIS for my local airport.
ATIS information, Echo, 4, Echo, Golf, November, Tango, at time, 1750, runway in use, 07, threshold QFE for runway, 908.
ATIS is updated every so often when new information becomes current, and each update is usually accompanied by an identification somewhere along the phonetic alphabet. Pilots report that identification, and controllers would then be aware of what information the pilots have and are operating with. Sure enough, Captain Greenlee reported to Charlotte Approach that they had Information Yankee. Information Yankee went live at 5:51 about 40 minutes ago with the following: scattered clouds 5,000 feet, visibility 6 miles, haze, temperature 88, dew point 67, wind 150 degrees at 8 knots, air pressure 30.01 inches of mercury, runways in use 18 left and 18 right. At that point in the flight, Information Yankee was current, though with the developing storms it is already inaccurate, as Information Yankee more reflected the weather they flew out with to Colombia, not as it actually was now. A new weather report would come in soon, but in the meantime Charlotte Approach tells Flight 1016 to expect what was at the time runway 18 right for landing. Now, the airport did have accurate ILS equipment for all of the runways at Charlotte that could assist in landing, but since the weather conditions had been fine all day, visual approaches were being issued at this time. Though it's 6:29, our crew get an indication that the weather situation may be worsening. There's more rain than I thought there was. It's starting pretty good a minute ago, now it's held up. With the weather souring and the aircraft descending, the pilots can now see the first signs of rainfall on their weather radar. The DC-9's onboard weather radar could depict regions of rainfall with varying degrees of intensity, going from green indicating light rain to yellow, moderate rain, and red, heavy rain. Switching on and drawing their attention in on the weather radar, what they find are multiple storm cells in the Charlotte area. They catch one to the south of the airport and one to the east. The weather radar depicts these storms as red regions surrounded by regions of yellow. It's never desirable to fly through uncomfortable weather, so wherever possible, pilots will try to avoid the nastiest of weather and go around it. And air traffic control will usually try to be accommodating in that regard as well. The time is now 6:30 and still southwest of the airport. Gauging the weather situation, the pilots can see that buildups of rain could be working their way into the regions that Flight 1016 will soon be flying straight into. We're showing a little build-up here. It looks like it's sitting on the radial. We'd like to go about 5 degrees to the left. How far ahead are you looking, 1016? About 15 miles. For an arrival onto runway 18 right, flight 1016 will have to fly past the airport and turn and land from the north. That said, one of these build-ups looks to be in that area. Now, Charlotte Control does assure the crew that they will be brought in before they reach that point, allowing them to intercept the ILS at a waypoint denoted as SOF. Acknowledging this, Flight 1016 is handed over to Charlotte's final Radar West controller as the pilots continue their descent. Though these storms may interfere with original plans, for the crew, it's not at the point it would ultimately threaten their arrival. Over in the control tower, air traffic controllers are beginning to see the onset of rain showers as these storms continue to grow and move in over the airport. The tower supervisor even commented, "It's raining like hell," in reference to the rain that was now pouring down on the south side of the airport. The course of the conversation in the tower makes it clear that visual approaches should now be abandoned in favor of utilizing the ILS on runway 18 right instead. Charlotte is a busy airport and there were multiple other flights on approach during all of this in addition to Flight 1016. USAir 677, a Fokker 28 aircraft, was already on final approach for runway 18 right. There was also USAir Flight 983, a Fokker 100 behind them, also conducting an arrival to runway 18 right. Piedmont Airlines Flight 3211, a smaller de Havilland -8 aircraft, was flying an approach to runway 23, the intersecting runway at Charlotte from the east. All of these planes, despite the storms, would ultimately land safely and without much difficulty. As USAir 1016 had just opened communication on final Radar West, this change in approach is handed over to our crew. I'll tell you what, USAir 1016, they got some rain just south of the field. Might be a little coming off the north. Just expect the ILS now, amend your altitude and maintain 3000. This transmission was made at 6:36. Now, it turns out that at the very same time, a new weather report had just been published. The new current weather details as the following. Broken clouds 4,500 feet. Visibility 6 miles. Rain showers. Haze. Wind 170 at 9 knots. Air pressure 30.02 and thunderstorms in the vicinity. These storms have now continued to move in overhead the airport, bringing heavy rain and lightning. The Charlotte ATIS is now in the process of being updated with this new information and would be denoted as Information Zulu. But the new broadcast would not go live until 6:43, by which point things would be too late and Flight 1016 would not get this ATIS update. Unfortunately, as it happened, this new current weather was also not forwarded to the flight from a controller. We have a situation here where a flight crew is operating without a complete image of the current weather. Our pilots, with their image constructed with their onboard weather radar, visual observations, and now an obsolete weather report, are electing to continue their approach. The controller's choice of wording in their previous transmission, "some rain, a little coming off the north," may have gone a long way in solidifying in the minds of the pilots that the weather may be a little bumpy, but it's not that bad. Perhaps playing into any planned continuation bias the crew may have. The reality is that Flight 1016 is about to fly straight into a massive thunderstorm, something pilots don't normally do. Meanwhile, on the ground in Charlotte, multiple other planes are preparing for departure, and in the minutes between 6:30 and 6:40, pilots on the ground would report rain showers becoming much heavier, the storm further intensifying. USAir Flight 806 has been delaying their departure precisely due to the weather. The pilot of that aircraft even recalled seeing another departing USAir flight immediately disappear into the clouds after takeoff. They reported lightning and described what appeared to be a wall of water, a downpour coming up from the south. Meanwhile, USAir Flight 797 is holding short by runway 18 right. The captain of this aircraft recalled that when they left the gate there was no rain, but by the time they got in position the aircraft was drenched. With their weather radar returning stormy activity, they chose to hold position and wait for conditions to improve. It was during this time that USAir 983, the inbound Fokker 100 aircraft, was conducting their final approach. USAir 797 on the ground could see the approaching plane, at which point another downpour opened up behind them, which increased with intensity over a very short period of time around the north side of the airport, and right on the final approach path for runway 18 right. Guess which plane is following in behind? It's now 6:39. USAir 1016 is now northeast of the airport, turning for final. They now tune into Charlotte Tower, who issues them with a landing clearance. USAir 1016, runway 18 right, clear to land, he speaks. The tower controller finishes saying that the DC-9 should follow USAir 983, the Fokker 100 aircraft, ahead of them. As that aircraft touched down, the pilot of that plane reports on frequency that they had a smooth ride all the way in, even if the plane encountered a sudden rain shower during the rollout on the runway. 6:40. Our aircraft is now lined up with the runway. It was on final approach that Flight 1016 inquires about the winds. Charlotte Tower, as requested, updates the crew on the current wind, but at 6:41, Tower gets back on frequency and drops the following. Wind shear alert, northeast boundary, winds 190 at 13. The airport's wind shear detection system has given out a warning for wind shear around the airport. Wind shear occurs where there is a significant change in wind speed and direction over a short distance. Its presence can therefore cause some problems for airplanes. Turbulence, a sudden change of airspeed and performance, and at its extreme, a loss of lift, which can be particularly troublesome for approaching aircraft that are already of decreased airspeed and low to the ground. The so-called low-level wind shear alerting system was for many years the best way of detecting wind shear, and many airports, including Charlotte, had one. Here's how it worked. A series of sensors strategically placed throughout the airport grounds, in this case there were a total of 6, would collect wind data including wind speed and direction. There was one station positioned in the middle of the airport between the two parallel runways, and the other stations were placed at different locations meant to cover each of the airport's runways at the 4 corners of the airport. Each of these stations transmit their data to the master station, which was the central one in this case, and that data is then analysed, probing for wind shear. If one or more of these stations detect differences greater than the established average, this sends a wind shear alert. At precisely 6:40 and 37 seconds, Station 1, the central station, signals wind shear first, followed by Stations 2 and 3 at 6:41, but by 6:43, all stations of the LLWAS were alerting wind shear, all of them reporting a massive difference in wind speed and direction. The wind shear warning prompts controllers to issue a verbal warning to aircraft on frequency, and as we saw, it's on the transcript, Charlotte Tower did announce a wind shear warning, though they didn't say in this transmission which aircraft that was going to, though the aircraft behind Flight 1016 would get that. A controller handling the east sector would also announce a similar wind shear warning with it addressed to all aircraft, but obviously Flight 1016 was not tuned into that station. The wind shear situation was crazy, because it was a whole lot more than I think any pilot or controller that day really expected, and well, we'll talk about it soon. Now proceeding with final approach, the landing gear is lowered. The windshield wipers are switched on and the flaps extended to the full 40-degree position. Without fully realizing what they had just gotten themselves into, Flight 1016 now enters the storm. They are hit with some turbulence and rain starts battering the windshield. They continue descending, bringing the DC-9 ever closer to the ground, and reaching the red zone of the storm, rain is so heavy that investigators would later even be able to hear the rain batter the windshield of the aircraft on the cockpit voice recording. It's like a wall of rain has suddenly appeared, the heavens opening with a massive downpour flooding their aircraft. The ride is bumpy and visibility drops. They can no longer see the airport, which for most of the approach they had been able to maintain visual contact with. "There's 10 knots right there," First Officer Hayes comments. "Okay, you're plus 20 knots, Captain Greenlee quickly follows up with. Having now just vanished somewhere into the storm, both pilots recognize that it's best to abandon the approach and go around. Captain Greenlee calls it, because if the vibes are off, you can always just go around. However, just as they execute the missed approach, they find themselves in a really strong, intense part of the storm. It's very windy, the plane is being pushed around all over the place, and it's becoming harder to control. They've encountered something strong, something windy and unstable. What the hell is going on?" The date is now August 28th, 1971. It's 6:30 in the evening. Malev Hungarian Airlines Flight 731 is en route to Copenhagen, completing the first leg of a journey home to Budapest, having departed our old friend Oslo Fornebu Airport about 45 minutes ago. At the controls is 56-year-old Captain Szent-Györgyi Dezsa. As far as Hungarian aviation goes, Captain Szent-Györgyi is a flying legend, as he was the top flying ace of the Hungarian Air Force in World War II. However, his immense flying ability was not enough to save him from the unknown he was about to get himself and his plane into. In preparation for landing at Copenhagen, Flight 731 establishes contact with controllers in Malmö, Sweden, who clear the flight to a lower altitude for approach, handing them over to Copenhagen Approach Control. Right now, they are making course on an inbound radial towards Malmö. Flight 731 will then intercept the ILS for runway 22 left at Copenhagen. When contact with Copenhagen Approach was established at 6:43, Flight 731 was given a final altitude of 1,500 feet and cleared to join the ILS. Up till this point, the flight had been uneventful. Everything was normal and routine. That said, the weather is troublesome, with building storms and rain showers in the vicinity. But proceeding toward the airport, at 6:50 Flight 731 turns south to intercept the glide slope ILS. Copenhagen tower controllers watched the plane on their radar screens, and despite the weather, everything worked as expected, until the radar echo of Flight 731 doesn't disappear so much as it goes faint, with a strong clutter of radar mess appearing right where the aircraft was on the radar screen. Flight 731 seemed to disappear straight into it. At the same time, the Hungarian plane was lining up on the ILS, which means the aircraft is over the Öresund, the stretch of water that separates Sealand with Sweden. More precisely, Flight 731 is passing north of the island of Saltholm, but then, suddenly, our captain loses control of the aircraft. Out of nowhere, the plane is battling violent winds. With so little altitude, the captain desperately tries to wrestle back control of the plane with little luck. He has no idea what is going on. It's as if the plane is being pressed towards the water below. Some unforeseen force is pushing on the plane, and he doesn't know how to deal with it. Recovery attempts were unsuccessful as Flight 731 plunged into the Öresund, approximately 5.7 nautical miles short of the runway in Copenhagen. The crash took the lives of 34 people, leaving just 2 survivors. So, I am actually here in Copenhagen now, and I figured I would just show you where this plane crashed real quick. And the accident occurred somewhere just over there, over this body of water. This is the Öresund. But we are not staying here for long because we have to go to the library. For years, no one really knew why this plane crashed, but it turns out that this aircraft and USAir Flight 1016 encountered the same type of weather anomaly. The Danish investigation obviously didn't know that going in, and they had little to work with at the time, as the aircraft carried neither a flight data recorder nor a cockpit voice recorder. In their efforts to find a cause, they employed a process of elimination. They considered loss of engine power, which was ruled out, as was sabotage, a mid-air collision, a weight and balance shift, mechanical or flight control failure. They were ruling out all leads as dead ends, and to the Danes, this accident didn't seem to make much sense. Though suspicion early on did turn to the weather, as it was a pretty nasty day in Denmark. In the 12 minutes before the crash, 4 other planes arrived in Copenhagen on the runway 22 left approach. Though these planes landed uneventfully despite all of their crews reporting low visibility, turbulence, rain showers, or some combination of the above. The aircraft immediately following Flight 731 behind them, a DC-9, was 5 miles behind the Hungarian flight, and they wound up flying through what appeared to be just similar conditions as the others that day. Stormy, reduced visibility, and heavy rain showers on the approach path. But even still, they landed safely with no additional comments from the crew. If the weather was related to the outcome of the disaster, did something occur in that window of time that Malev 731 unfortunately caught? Whatever happened, it struck the aircraft during a vulnerable time. In landing configuration, flaps extended, landing gear down, reduced airspeed, and low to the ground, or water, the crew were not able to recover from whatever upset they encountered. The best the Danish investigation could come up with was a significant loss or deterioration of airflow on the plane's flight control surfaces, following through into loss of control. In fact, here is how they describe it in their accident report. The probable cause of this accident was a loss of control of the aircraft at the moment where the aircraft was about to intercept the glide slope to runway 22 left at Copenhagen Airport Kastrup. Although it has not been possible to establish the cause of the loss of control, it is most likely to believe that the aircraft, in landing configuration, was affected by a deterioration of airflow over the tailplane to such a degree that longitudinal stability was lost. Whilst there were missing answers here, one thing they couldn't confirm or rule out was the involvement of wind shear. By the way, this accident report is not available on the internet as far as I know, and I had to travel to the library in Tornby in Copenhagen to find this thing, and as far as I'm aware, only 2 copies of it exist, and they are both here in the library's local archive. So, there's that. But now it's time for Weather Chloe to start putting all of this together for you. You see, it's interesting, in retrospect, to look back at the Malev investigation and see how they discussed this accident. That happened in 1971, and they couldn't find a cause for the loss of control. But we, today, have a better understanding of meteorology from the decades since then, and we do now know what more than likely caused this crash. And if you are a meteorologist or a pilot, you probably already know where this is going. Malev 371 and USAir 1016 encountered what is known as a microburst, or downburst more broadly. What may characterize a microburst over a macroburst is the scale of the event, but that's beside the point. When the Malev disaster occurred, these downburst events were poorly understood, so Danish investigators had to operate without the same level of meteorological understanding compared to when the NTSB later looked at the USAir case. In this section, we're going to break down what a microburst is, how they are formed, how they affect aircraft, and how pilots respond to them. And then we're going to circle back around and tie this into USAir Flight 1016. Remember when that was what the video was about? Well, it's time to get windy. A microburst is a concentrated, localized bursting downdraft that plunges straight down towards the ground and then scatters in all directions. Whilst microbursts are often associated with thunderstorms, they don't always require a parent storm. In previous videos, we've looked at the formation of standard thunderstorms, and even tornado formation. And microbursts, given the right conditions, are another one of these weather events that are spawned out of the instability of these convective systems. Rising warm air, what we call the updraft, brings in a lot of heat, air and moisture feeding and building the storm, and the most extreme of these form into massive cumulonimbus clouds that tower tens of thousands of feet high. These updrafts can be really powerful, suspending large amounts of mass, but eventually, as a storm matures, these updrafts weaken and the cloud can no longer hold onto all of that mass it had previously suspended. This is what enables the downburst. A storm just drops it because it's too heavy. The cooling downdraft then breaks out of the storm, going straight down towards the ground. And when this burst of air does meet the ground, it scatters in all directions. The outflow of the microburst creates strong vortexes of air that curl up, resulting in a lot of turbulence and low-level wind shear. If you've never seen what a microburst looks like, I promise you it is magical to witness. It just looks like the heavens open up and the cloud blasts a big one. By the way, this example we can see here, this is called a wet microburst, characterized by all of the moisture and rain that comes down with it. They can also be invisible and not be accompanied by the same moisture. We call these dry microbursts. Microbursts are quite rare and don't exactly have a long lifespan. They last no more than a few minutes at a time, but that said, they can still inflict significant damage and be a danger to life in the wrong circumstances. The massive downdraft can bring winds with speeds up to and even possibly exceeding 150 km per hour, enough to rip trees from their roots, blow cars off of roads, and rip the roofs from houses, resulting in damage similar to that of a weaker tornado. For airplanes, the danger lies in the significant wind shear that a microburst brings. Wind shear, as we mentioned before, is the result of a significant change of wind speed and direction over a short distance, and, as we've seen, the microburst takes that to its extreme if we imagine winds blowing out in all directions in a localized space. If one were to fly directly into a microburst, you'll first experience a strong headwind, which may even increase aircraft performance with an increase in indicated airspeed. Though once hitting the vertical portion of the microburst, the plane is pushed and pressed down. Then finally, a pilot can expect a tailwind, blowing the plane from behind, which will result in a loss of performance and a significant drop in airspeed. But let's remind ourselves that microbursts are radial and can occur anywhere, meaning that if a plane does encounter a microburst, it could also be from the side, which could bring about strong crosswinds. It's going to make for an uneasy ride either way. Wind shear affects a plane's performance in real time with great effects on airspeed and lift output. And because these events are low level, the danger is particularly high during the approach and landing phases. It is more than likely that this is what brought Malév Flight 731 down. If pilots are not prepared for it, they can be caught out, especially in the tailwind. There was no microburst training for the Malév crew, therefore the pilots could not recognize what they had encountered or how to deal with it. To that end, multiple other tragic accidents have happened since all over the world that were at least in part caused by one of these downbursts. But things began to change in the mid-1980s, especially in the wake of Delta Airlines Flight 191, a different case, this time involving a massive Lockheed TriStar that found itself in the midst of microburst-induced wind shear. The crash killed 137 people. The findings of the Delta investigation paved the way for sweeping changes in weather detection and pilot training, so by the time that 1994 rolled around, generally pilots had the knowledge they needed to recover. The microburst exit strategy requires applying maximum thrust to the engines. Pilots must maintain a positive nose pitch and keep the wings level and possibly execute a go-around if necessary. They basically ride it out. So, did USAir 1016 encounter a microburst? Well, it would seem so, but before we draw any conclusions from this, consider that it wasn't the sole factor in the outcome of the accident. Far from it. Let's now examine how the pilots handled the final moments of the flight. Flight 1016 properly encountered the microburst during the missed approach phase of the flight, but the reason the go-around was initiated in the first place was not because our pilots had identified wind shear. It was more of a case of encountering strong turbulence, heavy rainfall, and overall losing visual contact with the airport. Weather simulations and studies in the aftermath of the accident pinned the centre of the microburst at the very northwest corner of the airport, about 900 feet west of the runway 18 right threshold. For our DC-9, the change in winds as it flew through the microburst resulted in a change from a 35-knot headwind to a 26-knot tailwind. This raises an interesting question, because what I haven't told you yet is that the DC-9 had an onboard wind shear detection system, a development that came out of previous investigations. The wind shear detection system used sensors on the fuselage and wing flaps to give warning upon encountering wind shear, giving pilots time to act. The warning was supposed to activate by visually flashing the master caution light, accompanied by an oral warning. But here's the thing. The wind shear warning did not at all activate on Flight 1016. The pilots could not recall its activation when later questioned by investigators, and the cockpit voice recording can back that up. The wind shear detection system was made for scenarios like this, and to be clear, it should have activated. So why didn't it? Unfortunately, a clear answer was never uncovered. However, what we can say is that during the missed approach execution, the conditions for the wind shear alert to activate were no longer met. You see, as part of the missed approach procedure, the flaps need to be retracted from their full or landing setting to the 15-degree setting. Whilst the flaps are in transit, the wind shear warning is inhibited as to prevent nuisance alerts. This meant that as Flight 1016 was experiencing perhaps the strongest of the wind shear, the warning system was made inoperative by its own design. But then again, even when the flaps had reached the new 15-degree setting, the warning still didn't go off, and investigators couldn't find a solid answer for this, leaving the possibility of an unforeseen flaw in the software preventing its activation. With no wind shear warning from either the plane or the airport, the full severity of the weather was unknown to the crew. If they had the full picture, the following seconds may have turned out very differently. Our first officer employed a missed approach execution and not a wind shear or microburst escape. Full power from the engines was not utilized, and though he did achieve the decisive nose-up attitude of 15 degrees, he also rolled the plane to the right with a peak bank angle of 17 degrees, bringing Flight 1016 away from the airport. Now, if that nose pitch had been held, the aircraft would have managed to ride out of the wind shear and the crash that followed would not have occurred. Even with the strong downward velocity of the microburst, the plane was recoverable. The problem is that this nose pitch was not maintained, and we've seen this before, haven't we? In previous cases we have looked at, we have seen what can happen to pilots in high-stress situations during a go-around, especially in poor weather. Because, astonishingly, Captain Greenlee says the following words: "Down. Push it down." This is, honestly, a baffling thing to hear from a pilot in this situation, whilst they are so low to the ground and have barely executed the missed approach, but that is what he says. First Officer Hayes, with his hands on the control wheel, does not necessarily respond to his captain by pushing down, but rather, given the then current stabilizer trim of the aircraft, he only needed to release some back pressure on the control wheel for the nose to drop. From its peak of 15 degrees nose up, Flight 1016 drops to an attitude of 5 degrees nose down. The investigation would later put this down to our old friend the somatogravic illusion. The captain had become disoriented and believed the plane to have been excessively pitching upward. The plane was previously being held at 15 degrees nose up by the first officer, but the accelerative forces brought on by the go-around, a high thrust setting of the engines, this had caused our captain to misinterpret that acceleration as a continual increase in nose pitch, because those same forces apply the same effects on the human vestibular system, the inner ear. Therefore, his perceived increase in nose-up attitude would need to be addressed with a nose-down input as to prevent a stall of the aircraft. Though the captain was disoriented, he fell back on basic pilot intuition. Don't stall the plane, put the nose down. But unfortunately, this came with fatal consequences. We saw this exact same scenario when we looked at Africa Airways Flight 771 a few months back. When later questioned by investigators, neither of the pilots could remember this moment, even though it was on the record. The captain said this, and the first officer did this. They couldn't remember it. This somewhat reframes things, doesn't it? And what this now means is that the microburst, on its own, was not responsible for the accident. Ultimately, the change of pitch, right when the aircraft's position relative to the microburst meant they had now just encountered its tailwind, the change in pitch combined with the tailwind manifested in an enormous sink of the aircraft. The airspeed dropped dramatically, even to the point that the stall warning stick shake momentarily activated. Had the plane maintained that positive nose pitch with maximum thrust, keeping a bit of lift in there, they would have penetrated through the wind shear. The rapid sink as a result of the change of pitch can be felt by everyone on board, terrifying the passengers and flight attendants. One passenger described it as if they were dropping like a roller coaster. In the cockpit, the ground proximity warning system sounds. The DC-9 effectively flops into a grassy field just outside of the airport perimeter, at about a relative 45-degree angle from the runway heading. The plane impacted with enough force to completely destroy the landing gear. The plane remains largely intact as it still carried forward momentum. Plowing through bushes, the plane scrapes along the ground, the wing flaps leaving their mark in the grass. The right side engine reverse thrust buckets are forcefully pulled open. The DC-9's tail cone is ripped from the plane. The left wing shears off, igniting a blaze from the outpouring of jet fuel. The fuselage begins to skid, but unfortunately collides with a series of oak trees on its path. The result of this was a separation of the fuselage, destroying a large section of the forward economy class cabin from rows 3 to 8. All of the passengers sitting here were killed instantly when they were crushed against the trees. The aircraft, now severed into 3 major sections, slides onto a residential road just west of the airport. The nose section of the fuselage, including the cockpit, forward galley, and half of the first-class cabin, the left half, separates from the rest of the plane and comes to a rest on the road. The aft midsection of the fuselage, comprised of rows 9 through 14, bursts into flames, settling on the front lawn of the unfortunate residents in the path of Flight 1016. Meanwhile, the entire back end of the plane, rows 15 to 21, the flight attendant station, the 2 engines, and the tail fin, crashes into the side of the family home, destroying their garage. In the nose section of the aircraft, Captain Greenlee, First Officer Hayes, and Flight Attendant DeMary sustained minimal injuries and were otherwise unscathed. Richard was sat in the seat closest to the DC-9's main exit. He shouts, "Release seatbelts and get out." He doesn't know yet that the passenger cabin is missing from the nose section. Next to him, Flight Attendant Shelley Marquith has a broken kneecap and is struggling to get herself out of her seat. Mr. DeMary unbuckles her seatbelt and helps her away from the aircraft with the assistance of Captain Greenlee, who quickly emerged from the cockpit. First Officer Hayes, on the other hand, eventually comes around and leaves the aircraft via the cockpit window, and the injured flight attendant is assisted away from the aircraft, where they quickly discover that the cabin is completely destroyed. They couldn't see it right away, but in the nose section, only the cockpit, forward galley, and part of the first-class cabin, which was unoccupied, had fared the best. Immediately outside, angling away from the nose, is the torn-up, twisted remnants of the forward economy class cabin. It has been completely destroyed. Bits and pieces of airplane and human remains are strewn all along the path the aircraft took on the ground. Absolutely no one in rows 3 through 10 have survived. Outside the wreckage, our crew members finally get a glimpse of their situation, and for a second it looked so bad that it seemed only those in the no section could possibly have survived. Another section of the economy cabin is burning out on the front lawn of the family residence, taking the lives of those unfortunate to have been sat there. Only 2 passengers who were sitting in rows 11 and 14 respectively managed to escape their burning seats. The crew members gather on a small grassy patch just off of the main crash site, but now getting a good look at the situation, they can see a large chunk of the plane has been lodged into the side of the house. It is likely there are more survivors. Flight attendant Richard DeMary steps up and heads over to the home, examining the wreckage for a way inside of the plane. He comes round the back end of the tail and sort of climbs onto the plane where he spots a breakage in the plane's skin near the right engine. He knows the passenger cabin extends back here and there were passengers sitting there. He was just serving them only minutes ago. Now there is smoke pouring out from the inside. It's not easy to get in, but he knows he has to do something. Again, he shouts, "Release your seatbelts and get out! Release your seatbelts and get out!" Repeating this, if anything, this served as a good starting point for dazed passengers who may have survived. One of those passengers was the woman who was sitting in seat 18F, a right-side window seat. She hears DeMary's voice and makes her way through the smoke-filled cabin towards the opening where she spots Richard through the crevice. Immediately, she presents her baby. The young mother was traveling with her infant child who was riding in her lap. The little one has suffered injury, and without hesitation, Richard reaches through and pulls the child out to safety. The woman had miraculously survived with no injury, and she pleads with DeMary for help. She too is pulled through the opening, and her child were taken by the flight attendant to the garden shed of the home, a safe distance away from the plane. If they had survived, maybe there were others he could save too. He heads back over, shouting again, "Release your seatbelts and get out." Another woman responds, "Help me, I don't want to die." Richard again steps in to assist the lady, but shockingly she announces, "Help, I can't find my baby." The injured mother was sitting in seat 21C, the left aisle seat in the very last row. She too had a child sitting in her lap. Unfortunately, she lost grasp of the little one during the crash, and it would later be found out that the poor Ben had been thrown at least 3 rows ahead and died from blunt force trauma. Flight attendant DeMary is able to save the mother from the smoke-filled wreckage, pulling her out onto the grass. By this point, locals from the neighborhood arrive at the scene to assist survivors. Richard is contemplating his position. Does he go back to the aircraft? Touching the plane's skin, he immediately burns himself. It's getting extremely hot and he now has jet fuel on himself. He decides to go back round to the front of the house. During all of this, Captain Greenlee was concerned with the whereabouts of the other missing crew member, Karen Forch, who was stationed in the back of the aircraft. The DC-9 does have an aft ventral staircase that is used as a normal entry-exit for boarding. The door was unusable in this state, no one would have been able to free it. But it does turn out that Karen has also survived, and she eventually emerges from the wreckage, barefoot, with severe burns to her face, arms, and legs. She and several passengers had clambered out of the wreckage either through an emergency exit or through the breakage of the aft fuselage that was mangled into the garage of the home. Some passengers even fell into the garage or wound up in other parts of the house. Flight attendant DeMary, Captain Greenlee, and apparently some other kid from the neighborhood approach the front door of the house and break down the door. Turns out the family wasn't home as they were away for the 4th of July weekend. Making their way through the home, they want to get inside of the garage but struggle with the fact that the crash has made access, even via the house, difficult. However, they can still hear passengers crying out for help inside of the garage that is now filling with noxious smoke. "Help! I can't breathe!" one passenger shouts. Outside, fire and rescue has finally arrived. With emergency services now on the scene, they swiftly take over the rescue effort from the crew members and residents. Controlling the spread of the fire, they complete the rescue operation with a final head count of 20 survivors, out of a total of 57 occupants. The National Transportation Safety Board launched their investigation that evening. As both pilots survived the accident, their recollection of events during the flight was invaluable evidence in addition to the contents of the flight recorders. Focus was immediately homed in on the weather, and though a microburst was found to be the likely culprit in creating the environment the plane crashed in, it was not really the reason the plane crashed in the way it did. Planes can escape microbursts, and pilots in 1994 should have had the training to identify wind shear and microburst conditions. In their probable cause, investigators listed the following causal factors in the accident: the flight crew's decision to continue an approach into an area where a microburst was likely, the failure of the flight crew to recognize wind shear quickly, exacerbated by an error in the wind shear alert software. The wind shear alert system should have warned them about 8 to 9 seconds prior to impact. The failure of the flight crew to establish proper pitch and engine power that would have brought them out of the wind shear. And the lack of timely weather information by air traffic control to the crew of Flight 1016. Let's recognize that emergency training did save lives that day, and that is none clearer than the actions of flight attendant Richard DeMary, who took it upon himself to valiantly save at least a few lives from the smoke-filled wreckage. He was formally recognized for his heroism and received an award from the Flight Safety Foundation. Though our understanding of meteorology has continued to improve even since the 1990s with better detection systems, radars, and methods of scoping out severe weather, flight safety in all areas is always an ongoing process, and the safety value of your flight attendants should never be understated. Hello everyone, and Happy New Year! It feels a little strange to say that in February, but I haven't had much of a chance to say that yet, so Happy New Year, Happy February. Thank you all so much for watching this video and making it through to the end. I hope you liked it. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like, subscribe, and hit the bell to stay up to date for when new videos drop. I do have some very interesting videos lined up for this year, and I really can't wait to see how they go down, so be sure to stick around. I do want to keep this outro concise this time, so we are going to move on, and it is that time of the video where I take a moment to thank all of my incredible patrons over on Patreon for their continued and generous support of the channel. Their contributions go a long way in keeping my videos independent, and at least right now, also sponsor-free. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so be sure to pay your thanks to them on your way out here. Of course, we have a few folks to shout out who have pledged at the business and first class tiers, and their names are, beginning with the business class tier, Charlie Bulk, Mr. President 2608, Philip Hindle, Dina, and Marvin Meow. Thank you so much. And in the first class tier, we have Lucy Homan, Lehman Bros, and Claire Robinson. What total legends, the whole lot of them. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can always join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. All patrons get early access to all of the new videos at least 2 days before they go out publicly. If you do want to stay connected with me, I am most active on my Discord server these days, but I do have a Blue Sky and Twitter too, and all of those links will also be in the pinned comment. So I'll see you around. That is all from me today. I am finally going to shut the hell up. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye. I literally did it again, dude. I keep waving. There's no one here. I keep waving. I keep waving at the microphone. Why do I do that?